Okay, the reading for today is a famous treatise about the novel by the French novelist, French naturalist Émile Zola, who is often regarded as the founder of European naturalism in literature, and his influence on modern Japanese literature is enormous, and so that any study of modern Japanese literature invariably leads at some point to Émile Zola, so one has to become familiar with his ideas and his theories, which were very impactful in modern Japan. Naturalism, or Shizen Shugi in Japanese, comes into Japan around the 1890s, early 1900s, and it's usually described as evolving in two phases: early naturalism, Shizen Shugi, and later naturalism, Koki Shizen Shugi. And earlier naturalism is usually associated with Zola. It's sort of the more socially realistic novels that he describes in this essay and that he wrote in his works, the techniques and so forth that he employed in his works that emphasize social rules that guide human behavior, heredity and so forth. We will now read this key essay, a translation of this key essay, translated by, the translator is Belle Sherman. The translation came out in 1964. The original essay, which is, Le Roman expérimental, appeared in 1880, I think, was the first edition, and then again later in 1893. And I'm not sure when it was translated into Japanese for the first time, so I'll have to look that up, and I'll put the information about all of that stuff in the description to this video. But for now, I just want to read the full treatise, the translation of the treatise. The experimental novel included in this book, translated from the French by Belle Sherman, 1964. Okay, starting with the preface to the book. And this is fairly long, so I'm going to read as quickly as possible. The experimental novel. In my literary essays, I have often spoken of the application of the experimental method to the novel and to the drama. The return to nature, the naturalistic evolution which marks the century, drives little by little all the manifestation of human intelligence into the same scientific path. Only the idea of a literature governed by science is doubtless a surprise, until explained with precision and understood. It seems to me necessary then to say briefly and to the point what I understand by the experimental novel. Okay, I should just mention very briefly here that naturalism, of course, is a reaction to the artistic movement, the dominant artistic movement that preceded it, namely Romanticism. Okay, so Romanticism had grown overly sentimental and sort of excessively concerned with emotions and feelings and so forth. And this was, of course, the mid-19th century, the age of science, the age of positivism. So all of these scientific discourses and so forth converged into an artistic movement, a literary movement, that came to be known as naturalism. Okay, so this treatise by Zola is sort of one of the important articulations of that new sort of scientific understanding of art, of the emphasis on the objectivity and so forth. Okay, continuing. I really only need to adapt for the experimental method has been established with strength and marvelous clearness by Claude Bernard in his Introduction à l'étude de la médecine expérimentale. This work by a savant whose authority is unquestioned, will serve me as a solid foundation. I shall here find the whole question treated, and I shall restrict myself to irrefutable arguments and to giving the quotations which may seem necessary to me. This will then be but a compiling of texts, as I intend on all points to entrench myself behind Claude Bernard. It will often be but necessary for me to replace the word doctor by the word novelist, to make my meaning clear and to give it the rigidity of a scientific truth. Okay, so as we can see from this paragraph, he's overlaying his theory of the novel, his theory of literature, on top of a theory that already exists, that was written by a doctor about this sort of new understanding of science and of medicine and so forth. So this is sort of a injection into literature and into the arts, medical discourse and discourses of science, as I mentioned above. Continuing. What determined my choice and made me choose L'Introduction as my basis was the fact that medicine, in the eyes of a great number of people, is still an art, as is the novel. Because there's a note about that. You can read the note in the essay that I have distributed to you. Claude Bernard, all his life, was searching and battling to put medicine in a scientific path. In his struggle, we see the first feeble attempts of a science to disengage itself little by little from empiricism and to gain a foothold in the realm of truth by means of the experimental method. Okay, so this is the idea of the experimental method that he takes from Bernard and applies it to the novel, and it becomes the title for this treatise, the experimental novel. Claude Bernard demonstrates that this method, followed in the study of inanimate bodies in chemistry and in physics, should be also used in the study of living bodies, in physiology and medicine. I'm going to try and prove for my part that if the experimental method leads to the knowledge of physical life, it should also lead to the knowledge of the passionate and intellectual life. It is but a question of degree in the same path which runs from chemistry to physiology, then from physiology to anthropology and to sociology. The experimental novel is the goal. Okay, sociology, of course, the key word here. It's coming out of these positivistic movements that are big in the day, and Zola's novels are sort of a an attempt to turn literary arts into a sociology. So keep that word sociology in mind as you read this essay, and as you read his novels, and as you read the early naturalist novels of Japan as well. To be more clear, I think it would be better to give a brief résumé of L'Introduction before I commence. The applications which I shall make of the text will be better understood if the plan of the work and the matters treated are explained. Claude Bernard, after having declared that medicine enters the scientific path with physiology as its foundation and by means of the experimental method, first explains the differences which exist between the sciences of observation and the sciences of experiment. He concludes finally that experiment is but provoked observation. All experimental reasoning is based on doubt, for the experimentalist should have no preconceived idea in the face of nature, and should always retain his liberty of thought. He simply accepts the phenomena which are produced when they are proved. In the second part, he reaches his true subject and shows that the spontaneity of living bodies is not opposed to the employment of experiment. The difference is simply that an inanimate body possesses merely the ordinary external environment, while the essence of the higher organism is set in an internal and perfected environment endowed with constant physiochemical properties exactly like the external experiment. Hence there is an absolute determinism in the existing conditions of natural phenomena, for the living as for the inanimate bodies. Okay, so underline this term determinism, which is very important in the context of literary naturalism. Determinism, this idea of determinism, some sort of larger social forces or larger genetic forces or biological forces driving the events of the story is a key feature or hallmark of literary naturalism, determinism. Continuing, he calls determinism the cause which determines the appearance of these phenomena. This nearest cause, as it is called, is nothing more than the physical and material condition of the existence of or manifestation of the phenomena. The end of all experimental method, the boundary of all scientific research, is then identical for living and for inanimate bodies. It consists in finding the relations which unite a phenomenon of any kind to its nearest cause, or in other words, in determining the conditions necessary for the manifestation of this phenomenon. Experimental science has no necessity to worry itself about the why of things. It simply explains the how. Next page. What determined my choice? あれちょっと待って After having explained the experimental considerations common to living beings and to inanimate, Claude Bernard passes to the experimental considerations which belong specifically to living beings. The great and only difference is this, that there is presented to our consideration in the organism of living beings a harmonious group of phenomena. He then treats of practical experiments on living beings, of vivisection, of the preparatory anatomical conditions, of the choice of animals, of the use of calculation in the study of phenomena, and lastly of the physiologist's laboratory. Finally, in the last part of the Introduction, he gives some examples of physiological experimental investigations in support of the ideas which he has formulated. He then furnishes some examples of experimental criticism in physiology. In the end, he indicates the philosophical obstacles which the experimental doctor encounters. He puts in the first rank the false application of physiology to medicine, the scientific ignorance as well as certain illusions of the medical mind. Further, he concludes by saying that empirical medicine and experimental medicine, not being incompatible, ought, on the contrary, to be inseparable one from the other. His last sentence is that experimental medicine adheres to no medical doctrine nor any philosophical system. This is very broadly the skeleton of L'Introduction, stripped of its flesh. I hope that this rapid exposé will be sufficient to fill up the gaps which my manner of proceeding is bound to produce. For, naturally, I shall cite from the work only such passages as are necessary to define and comment upon the experimental novel. I repeat that I use this treatise merely as a solid foundation on which to build, but a foundation very rich in arguments and proofs of all kinds. Experimental medicine, which but lisps as yet, can alone give us an exact idea of experimental literature, which, being still unhatched, is not even lisping. Okay, so that's the end of his preface to his long treatise, The Experimental Novel. Okay, so moving on now to part 1, chapter 1 of his treatise. The first question, let me pause here. The first question which presents itself is this: is experiment possible in literature, in which up to the present time observation alone has been employed? Sort of a rather dubious claim, I should add. Obviously more than mere observation is involved in literature. I will try not to interject my own thoughts as I read this. I'll just read it. Continuing. Claude Bernard discusses observation and experiment at great length. There exists, in the first place, a very clear line of demarcation, as follows. The name of observer is given to him who applies the simple or complex process of investigation in the study of phenomena which he does not vary, and which he gathers consequently as nature offers them to him. The name of experimentalist is given to him who employs the simple and complex process of investigation to vary or modify, for an end of some kind, the natural phenomena, and to make them appear under circumstances and conditions in which they are not presented by nature. For instance, astronomy is a science of observation, because you cannot conceive of an astronomer acting upon the stars, while chemistry is an experimental science, as the chemist acts upon nature and modifies it. This, according to Claude Bernard, is the only true and important distinction which separates the observer from the experimentalist. I cannot follow him in his discussion of the different definitions given up to the present time. As I have said before, he finishes by coming to the conclusion that experiment is but provoked observation. I repeat his words. In the experimental method, the search after facts, that is to say, investigation, is always accompanied by a reason, so that ordinarily the experimentalist makes an experiment to confirm and verify the value of an experimental idea. In this case, you can say that experiment is an observation instigated for the purpose of verification. End quote. To determine how much observation and experimenting there can be in a naturalistic novel, I only need to quote the following passages. Quote, "The observer relates purely and simply the phenomena which he has under his eyes. He should be the photographer of phenomena. His observation should be an exact representation of nature. He listens to nature and he writes under its dictation. But once the fact is ascertained and the phenomenon observed, an idea or hypothesis comes into his mind, reason intervenes, and the experimentalist comes forward to interpret the phenomenon. The experimentalist is a man who, in pursuance of a more or less probable but anticipated explanation of observed phenomena, institutes an experiment in such a way that, according to all probability, it will furnish a result which will serve to confirm the hypothesis or preconceived idea. The moment that the result of the experiment manifests itself, the experimentalist finds himself face to face with a true observation which he has called forth, and which he must ascertain, as all observation, without any preconceived idea. The experimentalist should then disappear, or rather transform himself instantly into the observer, and it is not until after he has ascertained the absolute results of the experiment, like that of an ordinary observation, that his mind comes back to reasoning, comparing, and judging whether the experimental hypothesis is verified or invalidated by these same results." End quote. The mechanism is all there. It is a little complicated, it is true, and Claude Bernard is led on to say, quote, "When all this passes into the brain of a savant who has given himself up to the study of a science as complicated as medicine still is, then there is such an entanglement between the result of observation and what belongs to experiment that it will be impossible and besides useless to try to analyze in their inextricable melange each of these terms." End quote. In one word, it might be said that observation indicates and that experiment teaches. Now, to turn to the novel, we can easily see that the novelist is equally an observer and an experimentalist. So the novelist is both. The observer in him gives the facts as he has observed them, suggests the point of departure, displays the solid earth on which his characters are to tread and the phenomena to develop. Then the experimentalist appears and introduces an experiment, that is to say, sets his characters going in a certain story so as to show that the succession of facts will be such as the requirements of the determinism of the phenomena under examination call for. Here it is nearly always an experiment pour voir, as Claude Bernard calls it. The novelist starts out in search of a truth. I will take as an example the character of the Baron Hulot in Cuisine Bête by Balzac. The general fact observed by Balzac is the ravages that the amorous temperament of a man makes in his home, in his family, and in society. As soon as he has chosen his subject, he starts from known facts. Then he makes his experiment and exposes Hulot to a series of trials, placing him amid certain surroundings in order to exhibit how the complicated machinery of his passion works. Machinery, underline that word, very key term in the context of literary naturalism. Machinery, mechanistic, mechanisms and so forth. It is then evident that there is not only observation there, but that there is also experiment. As Balzac does not remain satisfied with photographing the facts collected by him, but interferes in a direct way to place his character in certain conditions, and of these he remains the master. The problem is to know what such a passion, acting in such a surrounding and under such circumstances, would produce from the point of view of an individual and of society. And an experimental novel, Cuisine Bête, for example, is simply the report of the experiment that the novelist conducts before the eyes of the public. In fact, the whole operation consists in taking facts in nature, then in studying the mechanism of these facts, acting upon them by the modification of circumstances and surroundings without deviating from the laws of nature. Finally, you possess knowledge of the man, scientific knowledge of him, in both his individual and social relations. Doubtless we are still far from certainties in chemistry and even physiology, nor do we know any more the reagents which decompose the passions, rendering them susceptible of analysis. Often in this essay I shall recall in similar fashion this fact, that the experimental novel is still younger than experimental medicine, and the latter is but just born. But I do not intend to exhibit the acquired results. I simply desire to clearly expose a method. If the experimental novelist is still groping in the most obscure and complex of all the sciences, this does not prevent this science from existing. It is undeniable that the naturalistic novel, such as we understand it today, is a real experiment that a novelist makes on man by the help of observation. Besides, this opinion is not only mine, it is Claude Bernard's as well. He says in one place, "In practical life, men but make experiments on one another," end quote. And again, in a more conclusive way, he expresses the whole theory of the experimental novel. Quote, "When we reason on our own acts, we have a certain guide, for we are conscious of what we think and how we feel. But if we wish to judge of the acts of another man, and know the motives which make him act, that is altogether a different thing. Without doubt, we have before our eyes the movements of this man in his different acts, which are, we are sure, the modes of expression of his sensibility and his will. Further, we even admit that there is a necessary connection between the acts and their cause. But what is this cause? We do not feel it. We are not conscious of it, as we are when it acts in ourselves. We are therefore obliged to interpret it and to guess at it from the movements which we see and the words which we hear. We are obliged to check off this man's actions one by the other. We consider how he acted in such a circumstance, and in a word, we have recourse to the experimental method." End quote. All that I have spoken of further back is summed up in this last phrase, which is written by a savant. I shall still call your attention to another illustration of Claude Bernard, which struck me as very forcible. Quote, "The experimentalist is the examining magistrate of nature." End quote. We novelists are the examining magistrates of men and their passions. But see what splendid clearness breaks forth when this conception of the application of the experimental method to the novel is adequately grasped and is carried out with all the scientific rigor which the matter permits today. A contemptible reproach which they heap upon us, naturalist writers, is the desire to be solely photographers. We have in vain declared that we admit the necessity of an artist's possessing an individual temperament and a personal expression. They continue to reply to us with these imbecile arguments about the impossibility of being strictly true, about the necessity of arranging facts to produce a work of art of any kind. Well, with the application of the experimental method to the novel, that quarrel dies out. The idea of experiment carries with it the idea of modification. We start, indeed, from the true facts, which are our indestructible basis, but to show the mechanism of these facts, it is necessary for us to produce and direct the phenomena. This is our share of invention. Here is the genius in the book. Thus, without having recourse to the questions of form and of style, which I shall examine later, I maintain even at this point that we must modify nature without departing from nature. when we employ the experimental method in our novels. If we bear in mind this definition, that observation indicates and experiment teaches, we can even now claim for our books this great lesson of experiment. The writer's office, far from being lessened, grows singularly from this point of view. An experiment, even the most simple, is always based on an idea, itself born of an observation. As Claude Bernard says, quote, "The experimental idea is not arbitrary, not purely imaginary. It ought always to have a support in some observed reality, that is to say, in nature." End quote. It is on this idea and on doubt that he bases all the method. Quote, "The appearance of the experimental idea," he says further on, "is entirely spontaneous and its nature absolutely individual, depending upon the mind in which it originates. It is a particular sentiment, a quid proprium, which constitutes the originality, the invention, and the genius of each one." End quote. Further, he makes doubt the great scientific lever. Quote, "The doubter is the true savant." So doubt, of course, coming from Descartes, right, is central to the naturalistic method. The doubter is the true savant. He doubts only himself and his interpretations. He believes in science. He even admits in the experimental sciences a criterion or a positive principle, the determinism of phenomena, which is absolute in living beings as in inanimate bodies. End quote. Thus, instead of confining the novelist within narrow bounds, the experimental method gives full sway to his intelligence as a thinker, and to his genius as creator. He must see, understand, and invent. Okay, note, underline invention here. Zola has used it, I think, 3 times already, stressing the point that the task of the naturalist artist is not simply photography or taking a picture of reality. Invention is also involved. Invention in Japanese might be translated into the traditional concept, aesthetic concept of shiko, right? Sekai and shiko, which we've talked about earlier. Shiko is invention. He must see, Ishikawa Jun, of course, uses the word hatsume a lot in his writings to convey this idea of shiko, which was a key idea in Edo period aesthetics and in his own works. He must see, understand, and invent. Some observed fact makes the idea start up of trying an experiment, of writing a novel, in order to attain to a complete knowledge of the truth. Then when, after careful consideration, he has decided upon the plan of his experiment, he will judge the results at each step with the freedom of mind of a man who accepts only facts conformable to the determinism of phenomena. He set out from doubt to reach positive knowledge, and he will not cease to doubt until the mechanism of the passion, taken to pieces and set up again by him, acts according to the fixed laws of nature. There is no greater, no more magnificent work for the human mind. We shall see further on the miseries of the scholastics, of the makers of systems, and those theorizing about the ideal, compared with the triumph of the experimentalists. I sum up this first part by repeating that the naturalistic novels observe and experiment, and that all their work is the offspring of the doubt which seizes them in the presence of truths little known and phenomena unexplained, until an experimental idea rudely awakens their genius some day and urges them to make an experiment, to analyze facts, and to master them. Okay, so again, the word doubt appears here. Underline that again. It's key to Zola's aesthetics or ideas of the novel. That's the end of part 1. On to chapter 2. Such then is the experimental method. But for such a long time it has been held that this method cannot be applied to living beings. This is the important point in the question that I am going to examine with Claude Bernard. The reasoning subsequently will be of the simplest. If the experimental method can be carried from chemistry and physics into physiology and medicine, it can also be carried from physiology into the naturalistic novel. Cuvier, to cite the name of only one scientific man, pretended that experiment as applied to inanimate bodies could not be used with living beings. Physiology, according to his way of thinking, should be purely a science of observation and of anatomical deduction. The vitalists even admit a vital force in unceasing battle with the physical and chemical forces neutralizing their action. Okay, so he probably has in mind Bergson and Henri Bergson when he speaks of vitalists here. Claude Bernard, on the contrary, denies all presence of a mysterious force and affirms that experiment is applicable everywhere. Okay, so Claude Bernard is in opposition to the vitalists, such as Bergson, who argue that the scientific method cannot be applied to living beings because they possess a kind of vital force that is irreducible, one might say. It's applicable everywhere. Quote from Bernard, "I propose," Bernard says, "to establish the fact that the science of the phenomena of life can have no other basis than the science of the phenomena of inanimate bodies, and that there are in this connection no differences between the principles of biological science and those of physics and chemistry. In fact, the end the experimental method proposes is the same everywhere. It consists in connecting by experiment the natural phenomena to their conditions of existence or to their nearest causes." End quote. It seems to me useless to enter into the complicated explanations and reasonings of Claude Bernard. I have already said that he insists upon the existence of an interior condition in living beings. Quote, "In experimenting on inanimate bodies," Bernard says, "there is only one condition to be considered, that is, the exterior earthly condition. While among the higher living organisms there are at least two conditions to consider: the exterior conditions, or extra-organic, and the interior, or inter-organic. The complexity due to the existence of an interior organic condition is the only reason for the great difficulties which we encounter in the experimental determination of living phenomena, and in the application of the means capable of modifying them." End quote. And he starts out from this fact to establish the principle that there are fixed laws governing the physiological elements plunged into an interior condition, as there are fixed laws for governing the chemical elements which are steeped in an exterior condition. Hence, you can experiment on a living being as well as on an inanimate one. It is only a question of putting yourself in the desired conditions. I insist upon this because, I repeat once more, the important point of the question is there. Claude Bernard, in speaking of the vitalists, writes thus, quote, "They consider life as a mysterious and supernatural agent, which acts arbitrarily, free from all determinism, and they condemn as materialists all those who endeavor to trace vital phenomena to definite organic and physico-chemical conditions. These are false ideas, which it is not easy to root out once they have become domiciled in the mind. Only the progress of science can dissipate them." End quote. So again, this quote is aimed at Bergson, I think it is safe to say. And he lays down this axiom, quote, "With living things as well as inanimate, the conditions of the existence of each phenomenon are determined in an absolute manner." Alright, so what we are talking about here, this is my little insertion, is really the fault line that runs throughout all modern literature, I think, both in the West and in Japan. Namely, the divide between, on the one hand, Bergson and the anti-naturalist camp that is trying to do something non-scientific, or that deny the claims of the scientific method and the naturalistic method, and on the other hand, the Shizen Shugi, or the naturalist group that is simply trying to follow the laws of science and convey reality as it is, sono mama, ari no mama, as we say in Japanese, right? And this tension between these two camps you find in Japanese literature starting in the 1880s, 1890s, and it runs all the way through the present. Alright, so this is exactly what Zola is writing about here. And Zola, of course, is in this faction. Okay, continuing. I restrain myself for fear of complicating the argument to too great an extent. Thus you see the progress which science has made. Zola in this camp, rather. Thus you see the progress which science has made. In the last century, a more exact application of the experimental method creates physics and chemistry, which then are freed from the irrational and supernatural. Men discover that there are fixed laws, thanks to analysis, and make themselves masters of phenomena. Then a new point is gained. Living beings, in which the vitalists still admitted a mysterious influence, are in their turn brought under and reduced to the general mechanisms of matter. Science proves that the existing conditions of all phenomena are the same in living beings as in inanimate, and from that time on physiology assumes little by little the certainty of chemistry and medicine. But are we going to stop there? Evidently not. When it has been proved that the body of man is a machine, right, so this idea of the body, human life, the man as a machine, is very much a Zola idea, a 19th century scientific or positivistic idea. When it has been proved that the body of man is a machine, very contrary to the Christian doctrine, of course, of what a man is. When it has been proved that the body of man is a machine, whose machinery can be taken apart and put together again at the will of the experimenter, then we can pass to the passionate and intellectual acts of man. Then we shall enter into the domain which up to the present has belonged to physiology and literature. It will be the decisive conquest by science of the hypotheses of philosophers and writers. Okay, this idea that science will conquer and defeat the position hitherto held by philosophers, religious figures, writers, artists, and so forth. So this kind of naive belief in science runs throughout Zola, right, and the naturalists. We have experimental chemistry and medicine. We shall have an experimental physiology, and later on an experimental novel. It is an inevitable evolution, the goal of which it is easy to see today. All things hang together. It is necessary to start from the determinism of inanimate bodies in order to arrive at the determinism of living beings. Again, emphasizing this idea that human beings are on a deterministic trajectory and there's nothing we can do about it. And since savants like Claude Bernard demonstrate now that fixed laws govern the human body, we can easily proclaim without fear of being mistaken the hour in which the laws of thought and passion will be formulated in their turn. A like determinism will govern the stones of the roadway and the brain of man. Okay, brain, keyword, underline that word. Man is no longer a soul, right, according to the 19th century scientistic faction, but rather a material stuff, a brain, right? And you still see this divide, of course, today, right? A lot of the debate right now over coronavirus is these two camps competing with one another about what man is, right? This opinion is to be found in the Introduction. I cannot repeat too often that I take all my arguments from Claude Bernard's work. After having explained that any completely special phenomena may be the result of the more and more complex combination and cooperation of the organized elements, he writes the following, and I quote, I am persuaded that the obstacles which surround the experimental study of psychological phenomena are in great measure due to difficulties of this order. For, notwithstanding the marvelous nature and the delicacy of their manifestations, it is impossible, so it seems to me, not to bring cerebral phenomena, like all the phenomena of living bodies, under the laws of scientific determinism. Okay, so Bernard is trying to bring everything in the cosmos, really, including human life and human behavior, under the laws of scientific determinism. And Zola is trying to do the same thing with literature and art. End quote. This is clear. Later, without doubt, science will find this determinism for all the cerebral and sensory manifestations of man. Okay, so I think if Zola had lived through the 20th century, he would have probably recanted a lot of this, I suspect, assuming he is a self-reflective man capable of admitting error. Now science enters into the domain of us novelists. Where'd I go? Hold on. Lost my place here. Now science enters into the domain of us novelists, who are today the analyzers of man in his individual and social relations. We are continuing by our observations and experiments the work of the physiologist, who has continued that of the physicist and the chemist. Okay, analyze, right? The analyzers of man is the phrase that was just used. Underline this word, analyze, right? You remember that the poet, who was it? It was I can't remember his name, but in romantic poetry of the preceding age, in romantic literature, analyze had negative connotations. It was a bad word. To analyze something was to kill it, right? But in this new scientific age, mid-19th century, and the world of naturalism, analyze becomes something good again, right? So analyze takes on positive valence. Chemists, continuing. We are making use in a certain way of scientific psychology to complete scientific physiology. And to finish the series, we have only to bring into our studies of nature and man the decisive tool of the experimental method. In one word, we should operate on the characters, the passions, on the human and social data, in the same way that the chemist and the physicist operate on inanimate beings, and as the physiologist operates on living beings, right? So we novelists, we artists, are to do what the scientists already do, and copy their techniques, mimic their techniques. Determinism dominates everything. It is scientific investigation. It is experimental reasoning, which combats one by one the hypotheses of the idealists, and which replaces purely imaginary novels by novels of observation and experiment. I underline again this phrase, observation and experiment. These three words that keep appearing in repetition. Observation and experiment, that Zola is emphasizing. I certainly do not intend at this point to formulate laws. In the actual condition of the science of man, the obscurity and confusion are still too great to risk the slightest synthesis. All that can be said is that there is an absolute determinism for all human phenomena. Okay, so he's doubling down. He's stressing his point even further here. It's an absolute determinism. There's no exception to this determinism for all human phenomena. From that on, investigation is a duty. We have the method. We should go forward. Even if a whole lifetime of effort ends but in the conquest of a small particle of truth. Look at physiology. Claude Bernard made grand discoveries, and he died protesting that he knew nothing, or nearly nothing. In each page he confesses the difficulties of his task. In the phenomenal relations, he says, Such as nature offers them to us, there always reigns a complexity more or less great. In this respect, the complexity of mineral phenomena is much less great than that of living phenomena. This is why the sciences restricted to inanimate bodies have been able to formulate themselves more quickly. In living beings, the phenomena are of enormous complexity, and the greater mobility of living organisms renders them more difficult to grasp and to define. End quote. What can be said then of the difficulties to be encountered by the experimental novel, which adds to physiology its studies upon the most delicate and complex organs, which deals with the highest manifestations of man as an individual and a social member? Evidently, analysis becomes more complicated here. Therefore, if the physiologist is but drawing up his principles today, it is natural that the experimental novelist should be only taking his first steps. We foresee it as a sure consequence of the scientific evolution of the century, but it is impossible to base it on certain laws. Since Claude Bernard speaks of, quote, the restricted and precarious truths of biological science, end quote, we can freely admit that the truths of the science of man, from the standpoint of his intellectual and passionate mechanism, are more restricted and precarious still. We are lisping yet. We are the last corners. But that should be only one incentive the more to push us forward to more exact studies. Now that we possess the tool, the experimental method, our goal is very plain, to know the determinism of phenomena and to make ourselves master of these phenomena. Okay. The idea that man will replace God and become as gods runs throughout this, a lot of the scientific discourse of the mid-19th century, late 19th century, and runs throughout Zola's treatise as well, right? To become masters of these phenomena and to understand the laws of determinism that guide these phenomena. Continuing, without daring, as I say, to formulate laws, I consider that the question of heredity, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, underline this word here, it's absolutely central to the European naturalism and to early Japanese naturalism as well, literary naturalism as well. Heredity, the idea that the laws of heredity guide human behavior. So character X behaves a certain way because he or she has inherited certain genes and features from his or her parents, who inherited those same features from their parents and so forth. I consider that the question of heredity has a great influence in the intellectual and passionate manifestations of man. I also attach considerable importance to the surroundings. I ought to touch upon Darwin's theories. Darwin underlined this, right? It's European literary naturalism is unthinkable without Darwin's influence, right? I ought to touch upon Darwin's theories, but this is only a general study of the experimental method as applied to the novel, and I should lose myself were I to enter into detail. Okay, so it doesn't go into detail, but Darwin's in the background of everything he says here. Keep that in mind as you read this. I will only say a word on the subject of surroundings. Okay, so environment, surroundings. Environment and surroundings, keyword in this context of literary naturalism, underline this word. We have just seen the great importance given by Claude Bernard to the study of those interorganic conditions which must be taken into account if we wish to find the determinism of phenomena in living beings. Well then, in the study of a family, of a group of living beings, I think that the social condition is of equal importance. Someday the physiologist will explain to us the mechanism of the thoughts and the passions. We shall know how the individual machinery of each man works, how he thinks, how he loves, how he goes from reason to passion and folly. But these phenomena, resulting as they do from the mechanism of the organs, acting under the influence of an interior condition, are not produced in isolation or in the bare void. Man is not alone, he lives in society, in a social condition, and consequently for us novelists, this social condition unceasingly modifies the phenomena. Indeed, our great study is just there, in the reciprocal effect of society on the individual and the individual on society. For the physiologist, the exterior and interior conditions are purely chemical and physical, and this aids him in finding the laws which govern them easily. We are not yet able to prove that the social condition is also physical and chemical. It is that certainly, or rather it is the variable product of a group of living beings who themselves are absolutely submissive to the physical and chemical laws which govern alike living beings and inanimate. From this we shall see that we can act upon the social conditions, in acting upon the phenomena of which we have made ourselves master in man. And this is what constitutes the experimental novel, to possess a knowledge of the mechanism of the phenomena inherent in man, to show the machinery of his intellectual and sensory manifestations under the influence of heredity and environment, such as physiology shall give them to us, and then finally to exhibit man living in social conditions produced by himself, which he modifies daily, and in the heart of which he himself experiences a continual transformation. Thus, then, we lean on physiology. We take man from the hands of the physiologist solely, in order to continue the solution of the problem and to solve scientifically the question of how men behave when they are in society. These general ideas will be sufficient to guide us today. Later on, when science is farther advanced, when the experimental novel has brought forth decisive results, some critic will explain more precisely what I have but indicated today. Elsewhere, Claude Bernard confesses how difficult it is to apply the experimental method to living beings. The living body, he says, especially among the higher animals, never falls into chemical or physical indifference with the exterior conditions. It possesses an incessant movement, right? An organic evolution, apparently spontaneous and constant, and notwithstanding the fact that this evolution has need of exterior circumstances to manifest itself, it is, however, independent in its course and movement. End quote. It seems he's conceding this point to his rival Bergson, right? Admitting that there is some sort of creative evolution or vitalist force that is not reducible to the laws of determinism and biological determinism, physical, material determinism, and so forth. And he concludes, as I have, quote, "In short, it is only in the physical and chemical conditions of the interior that we shall find the principle that governs the exterior phenomena of life." But whatever complexities may present themselves, and even when extraordinary phenomena are produced, the application of the experimental is imperative. If the phenomena of life have a complexity and an apparent difference from those of inanimate bodies, they do not offer this difference except by reason of determined or determinable conditions which belong to them. Therefore, even should the sciences dealing with life differ from the others in their application and in their special laws, they are not to be distinguished by their scientific method. End quote. So, he concedes a point to Bergson only to emphasize that his way of seeing things is right in the end. Moving on. I must say one word as to the limits which Claude Bernard assigns to science. According to him, we shall always be ignorant of the why of things. We can only know the how. It is this that he expresses in the following terms, quote, "The nature of our minds urges us to seek the essence of the why of things. In this we seek we see further than the goal it has been given us to attain to. For experiment soon teaches us that we must not go beyond the how, that is to say, beyond the nearest cause or the condition of the existence of any phenomenon. End quote. Further on, Bernard gives this example, quote, if we can discover why opium and its alkaloids produce sleep, we shall know the mechanism of such slumber and know how opium or its essence produces sleep. For slumber only takes place because the active substance is about to put itself in contact with certain organic elements which it modifies. End quote. The practical conclusion of all this is the following, quote, science has precisely the privilege of teaching us what we are ignorant of through its substitution of reason and experiment for sentiment, and by showing us clearly the limit of our actual knowledge. End quote. Not end quote. Continuing, Bernard, quote, continuing, but by a marvelous compensation in proportion as science humbles our pride, it strengthens our power, end quote. All these considerations are strictly applicable to the experimental novel. In order not to lose itself in philosophical speculation, in order to replace idealistic hypothesis by a slow conquest of the unknown, it must continue the search after the how of things. This is its exact role, and it is from this that it must draw, as we are going to see, its reason for being and its moral. I have reached this point. The experimental novel is a consequence of the scientific evolution of the century. It continues and completes physiology, which itself leans for support on chemistry and medicine. It substitutes for the study of the abstract and the metaphysical man the study of the natural man, governed by physical and chemical laws, and modified by influences of his surroundings. It is, in one word, the literature of our scientific age, as the classical and romantic literature corresponded to a scholastic and theological age. Now I will pass to the great question of the application of all this and of its justification. End chapter. Chapter 3. The object of the experimental method is physiology, and in medicine is to study phenomena in order to become their master. Claude Bernard, in each page of L'Introduction, comes back to this idea. He declares, quote, all natural philosophy is summed up in this, to know the laws which govern phenomena. The experimental problem reduces itself to this, to foresee and direct phenomena, end quote. Farther on, he gives an example, quote, it will not satisfy the experimental doctor, though it may the merely empirical one, to know that quinine cures fever. The essential thing is to know what fever is, and to understand the mechanism by which quinine cures. All this is of the greatest importance to the experimental doctor, for as soon as he knows it positively, the fact that quinine cures fever will no longer be an isolated and empirical fact, but a scientific fact. This fact will be connected then with the conditions which bind it to other phenomena, and we shall be thus led to the knowledge of the laws of the organism, and to the possibility of regulating their manifestations. End quote. A striking example can be quoted in this case of scabies. Quote, today the cause of this disease is known and determined experimentally. The whole subject has become scientific, and empiricism has disappeared. A cure is surely, and without exception, effected when you place yourself in the conditions known by experiment to produce this end. End quote. This then is the end. This is the purpose in physiology and in experimental medicine, to make one's self master of life in order to direct it. Let us suppose that science advances and that the conquest of the unknown is finally completed. The scientific age which Claude Bernard saw in his dreams will then be realized. When that time comes, the doctor will be the master of maladies. He will cure without fail. His influence upon the human body will conduce to the welfare and strength of the species. We shall enter upon a century in which man, grown more powerful, will make use of nature and will utilize its laws to produce upon the earth the greatest possible amount of justice and freedom. Underline this passage. It expresses this kind of exuberant optimism that characterized the late 19th century Europe. The greatest possible amount of justice and freedom. There is no nobler, higher, nor grander end. Here is our role as intelligent beings, to penetrate to the wherefore of things, to become superior to these things, and to reduce them to a condition of subservient machinery. Okay. So you sense the almost megalomaniacal hubris that runs through a lot of these passages in Zola. Moving on. Well, this dream of the physiologist and the experimental doctor is also that of the novelist, who employs this experimental method in his study of man as a simple individual and as social animal. Their object is ours. We also desire to master certain phenomena of an intellectual and personal order, to be able to direct them. We are, in a word, experimental moralists, showing by experiment in what way a passion acts in a certain social condition. The day in which we gain control of the mechanism of the passion, we can treat it and reduce it, or at least make it as inoffensive as possible. And in this consists the practical utility and high morality of our naturalistic works, which experiment on man, and which dissect piece by piece this human machinery in order to set it going through the influence of the environment. When things have advanced further, when we are in possession of the different laws, it will only be necessary to work upon the individuals and the surroundings if we wish to find the best social condition. In this way we shall construct a practical sociology, and our work will be a help to political and economical sciences. I do not know, I repeat, of a more noble work, nor of a grander application, to be the master of good and evil, to regulate life, to regulate society, to solve in time all the problems of socialism, above all to give justice a solid foundation by solving through experiment the questions of criminality. Is not this being the most useful and the most moral workers in the human workshop? Let us compare for one instant the work of the idealistic novelists to ours. And here this word idealistic refers to writers who cast aside observation and experiment and base their works on the supernatural and the irrational, who admit, in a word, the power of mysterious forces outside of the determinism of the phenomena. Claude Bernard shall reply to this for me, quote, "What distinguishes experimental reasoning from scholastic is the fecundity of the one and the sterility of the other. It is precisely the scholastic who believes he has absolute certitude, who attains to no results. This is easily understood, since by his belief in an absolute principle he puts himself outside of nature, in which everything is relative. It is, on the contrary, the experimenter who is always in doubt, who does not think he possesses absolute certainty about anything, who succeeds in mastering the phenomena which surround him, and in increasing his power over nature." End quote. By and by I shall return to this question of the ideal, which is in truth but the question of indeterminism. Claude Bernard says truly, quote, "The intellectual conquest of man consists in diminishing and driving back indeterminism, and so gradually, by the aid of the experimental method, gaining ground for determinism, end quote. We experimental novelists have the same task. Our work is to go from the known to the unknown, so to make ourselves master of nature, while the idealistic novelists deliberately remain in the unknown through all sorts of religious and philosophical prejudices, under the astounding pretense that the unknown is nobler and more beautiful than the known. If our work, often cruel, if our terrible pictures needed justification, I should find indeed with Claude Bernard this argument conclusive. Quote, "You will never reach really fruitful and luminous generalizations on the phenomena of life until you have experimented yourself and stirred up in the hospital, the amphitheater, and the laboratory, the fetid or palpitating sources of life. If it were necessary for me to give a comparison which would explain my sentiments on the science of life, I should say that it is a superb salon, flooded with light, which you can only reach by passing through a long and nauseating kitchen." End quote. I insist upon the word which I have employed, that of experimental novelists as applied to naturalistic novelists. One passage of the Introduction struck me as being very forcible, that in which the author speaks of the vital circulus. Quote, "The muscular and nervous organs preserve the activity of the organs which make the blood, but the blood, in its turn, nourishes the organs which produce it. There is in this a social or organic solidarity, which keeps a perpetual movement until the derangement of or cessation of the action of a necessary and vital element has broken the equilibrium or brought about some trouble or stoppage in the play of the animal machinery. The problem of the experimental doctor consists in finding the cause of any organic disarrangement, that is to say, in seizing the initial phenomenon. We shall see how a dislocation of the organism, or a disarrangement, the most complex in appearance, can be traced to a simple initial cause, which calls forth immediately the most complex effects." End quote. All that is necessary here is to change the words experimental doctor to experimental novelist, and this passage is exactly applicable to our naturalistic literature. The social circulus is identical with the vital circulus. In society, as in human beings, a solidarity exists which unites the different members and the different organisms in such a way that if one organism becomes rotten, many others are tainted, and a very complicated disease results. Hence, in our novels, when we experiment on a dangerous wound which poisons society, we proceed in the same way as the experimentalist doctor. We try to find the simple initial cause in order to reach the complex causes of which the action is the result. Go back once more to the example of Baron Hulot in Cuisine Bête. See the final result, the denouement of the novel. An entire family is destroyed. All sorts of secondary dramas are produced under the action of Hulot's amorous temperament. It is there in this temperament that the initial cause is found. One member, Hulot, becomes rotten, and immediately all around him are tainted. The social circulus is interrupted. The health of that society is compromised. What emphasis Balzac lays on the character of Baron Hulot. With what scrupulous care he analyzes him. The experiment deals with him chiefly because its object is to master the symptoms of this passion in order to govern it. Suppose that Hulot is cured, or at least restrained and rendered inoffensive. Immediately, the drama ceases to have any longer any raison d'être. The equilibrium, or more truly the health, of the social body is again established. Thus the naturalistic novels are really experimental moralists. And I reach thus the great reproach with which they think to crush the naturalist novelists by treating them as fatalists. Okay, underline this word fatalists. He's responding to the charge that naturalists are merely fatalists. How many times have they wished to prove to us that as soon as we did not accept free will, that as soon as man was no more to us than a living machine, acting under the influence of heredity and surroundings, we should fall into gross fatalism. We should debase humanity to the rank of a troop marching under the baton of destiny. It is necessary to define our terms. We are not fatalists. We are determinists, which is not at all the same thing. Claude Bernard explains the two terms very plainly. Quote, "We have given the name of determinism to the nearest or determining cause of phenomena. We never act upon the essence of phenomena in nature, but only on their determinism. And by this very fact that we act upon it, determinism differs from fatalism, upon which we could not act at all. Fatalism assumes that the appearance of any phenomenon is necessary apart from its conditions, while determinism is just the condition essential for the appearance of any phenomenon, and such appearance is never forced. Once the search for the determinism of phenomena is placed as a fundamental principle of the experimental method, there is no longer either materialism or spiritualism or inanimate matter or living matter. There remain but phenomena of which it is necessary to determine the conditions, that is to say, the circumstances which play by their proximity to these phenomena the role of nearest cause." End quote. This is decisive. All we do is to apply this method in our novels, and we are the determinists who experimentally try to determine the condition of the phenomena without departing in our investigations from the laws of nature. As Claude Bernard very truly says, the moment that we can act, and that we do act, on the determining cause of phenomena, by modifying their surroundings, for example, we cease to be fatalists. Here you have, then, the moral purpose of the experimental novelist clearly defined. I have often said that we do not have to draw a conclusion from our works, and this means that our works carry their conclusion with them. An experimentalist has no need to conclude, because in truth experiment concludes for him. 100 times, if necessary, he will repeat the experiment before the public. He will explain it, but he need neither become indignant nor approve of it personally. Such is the truth, such is the way phenomena work. It is for society to produce or not to produce these phenomena, according as the result is useful or dangerous. You cannot imagine, as I have said elsewhere, a savant being provoked with azote, because azote is dangerous to life. He suppresses azote when it is harmful and not otherwise. As our power is not the same as that of a savant, as we are experimentalists without being practitioners, we ought to content ourselves with searching out the determinism of social phenomena, and leaving to legislators and to men of affairs the care of controlling sooner or later these phenomena in such a way as to develop the good and reject the bad from the point of view of their utility to man. Underline this word utility. The philosophical idea of utilitarianism is in the background of a lot of these ideas. In our role as experimental moralists, we show the mechanism of the useful and the useless. We disengage the determinism of the human and social phenomena so that in their turn the legislators can one day dominate and control these phenomena. Underline this word dominate. This desire, will to dominate, runs through a lot of these natural works, which is kind of ironic that there's this will to dominate, this kind of Nietzschean will to dominate that runs through the naturalists. Ironic because Nietzsche was vehemently opposed to the naturalists and wrote some explicitly anti-naturalist passages in his works. In a word, we are working with the whole country toward that great object, namely the conquest of nature and the increase of man's power 100-fold. The increase of man's power and the conquest of nature. Underline that. Compare with ours the work of the idealistic writers who rely upon the irrational and the supernatural, and whose every flight upward is followed by a deeper fall into metaphysical chaos. We are the ones who possess strength and morality. Right. One could include Dostoevsky in this group that he's attacking in these last two sentences, right? I think if Dostoevsky were alive when this was written, I think Dostoevsky died a year after the initial publication of this work, but had he been alive to read it, he would have probably written a rebuttal, either as an essay or included a rebuttal in his fiction. Dostoevsky, of course, was very opposed to this kind of thinking. Alright, that's the end of chapter 3. Now we move on to chapter 4. We're going to have to pick up the pace. There's still several more chapters left. I want to get through it if possible. Moving on. I have said before that I chose L'Introduction because medicine is still looked upon by many as an art. Claude Bernard proves that it ought to be a science. And in his book we see the birth of a science, a very instructive spectacle in itself, and which shows us that the scientific domain is extending and conquering all the manifestations of human intelligence. Since medicine, which was an art, is becoming a science, why should not literature also become a science by means of the experimental method? Okay? So the strive to make everything legitimate by elevating it to the realm of science is a very strong impetus in a lot of late 19th century, early 20th century fields, right? In psychoanalysis, we see Freud trying to elevate psychoanalysis to the status of science, which has legitimacy and so forth. We see this in Marx's writings too, to elevate his own theories about capitalism and society and so forth to the status of Wissenschaft, right? And we see Zola here trying to elevate the status of art to Wissenschaft. It must be remarked that all things hang together. If the territory of the experimental doctor is the body of man, as shown in the phenomena of his different organs, both in their normal and pathological condition, our territory is equally the body of man, as shown by his sensory and cerebral phenomena, both in their normal and pathological condition. If we are not satisfied with the metaphysical man of the classical age, we must perforce take into consideration the new ideas on nature and on life with which our age has become imbued. We continue necessarily, I repeat, the work of the physiologist and the doctor, who have continued in their turn that of the physician and the chemist. Hence we enter into the domain of science. I will not touch on the question of sentiment and form, but will reserve that for another time. Let us see first what Claude Bernard says about medicine. Quote, certain doctors contend that medicine can only be conjectural, and they conclude that a doctor is an artist who ought to make up for the indeterminism in particular cases by his genius and his personal tact. All sciences have necessarily commenced by being conjectural. There are still today in every science conjectural parts. Medicine is still nearly all conjecture. I do not deny that, but I only want to say that modern science should make an effort to come out of this provisionary state which does not constitute a definite scientific condition, not any more for medicine than for the other sciences. The scientific condition will be longer in taking shape and more difficult to obtain in medicine by reason of the complexities of its phenomena. But the end of the medical savant is to reduce in his science, as in all the others, the indeterminate to the determinate. End quote. The mechanism of the birth and the development of a science is here clearly defined. Men still look upon the doctor as an artist, but there is in medicine an enormous place still left to conjecture. Naturally, the novelist merits still more the name of artist, but he finds himself buried still deeper in the indeterminate. If Claude Bernard confesses that the complexity of its phenomena will prevent medicine for a long time yet from arriving at a scientific state, what shall we say of the experimental novel, in which the phenomena are much more complicated still? But this does not prevent the novel from entering upon the scientific pathway, obedient to the general evolution of the century. Moreover, Claude Bernard himself has indicated the evolution of the human mind. The human mind, he says, at various periods of its progress has passed successively through feeling, reason, and experiment. First, feeling alone, dominating reason, created the truths of faith, that is to say, theology, reason or philosophy, and becoming afterward the mistress, brought forth scholasticism. Finally, experiment, that is to say, the study of natural phenomena, taught man that the truths of the exterior world were to be found formulated in the first place neither in reason nor in feeling. These last are indeed our indispensable guides, but to obtain the truth it is necessary to descend into the objective reality of things, where they lie concealed under their phenomenal form. Thus it is that in the natural progress of things the experimental method appears, which sums up the whole, and which supports itself successfully on the three branches of the immovable tripod, feeling, raison, and experiment. In the search after truth by means of this method, feeling has always the initiative. It engenders the idea a priori of or intuition. The idea a priori or intuition. Raison, or the reasoning power, immediately develops the idea and deduces its logical consequences. But if feeling must be guided by the light of reason, reason in its turn must be guided by expériment. End quote. I have given this passage entire, as it is of the greatest importance. It shows clearly the role that the personality of the novelist should play apart from the style. Since feeling is the starting point of the experimental method, since reason subsequently intervenes to end in expériment, and to be controlled by it, the genius of the expérimentaliste dominates everything, and this is what has made the experimental method so inert in other hands, such a powerful tool in the hands of Claude Bernard. I have said the word. Method is but the tool. It is the workman. It is the idea which he brings, which makes the chef d'oeuvre. I have already quoted these lines. Quote, "It is a particular feeling, a quid proprium, which constitutes the originality, the invention, and the genius of each one. This, then, is the part taken by genius in the experimental novel. As Claude Bernard says again, quote, "The idea is the seed. The method is the soil which furnishes the conditions for developing and prospering it and bringing forth its best fruits according to nature." End quote. Thus, everything is reduced to a question of method. If you are content to remain in the a priori idea and enjoy your own feelings without finding any basis for it in reason or any verification in experiment, you are a poet. You venture upon hypotheses which you cannot prove. You are struggling vainly in a painful indeterminism, and in a way that is often injurious. Listen to these lines of L'Introduction. Quote, "Man is naturally a metaphysician and proud. He believes that the idealistic creations of his brain, which coincide with his feelings, represent the reality. Thus it follows that the experimental method is not innate or natural to man, for it is only after having wandered for a long time among theological and scholastical discussions that he ends by recognizing the sterility of his efforts in this path. Man then perceives that he cannot dictate laws to nature, because he does not possess in himself the knowledge and the criterion of exterior things. He realizes that in order to arrive at this truth he must, on the contrary, study the natural laws and submit his ideas, if not his reason, to experiment, that is to say, to the criterion of facts. What becomes of the genius of the experimental novelist?" End quote. What becomes of the genius of the experimental novelist? The genius, the idea, a priori, remains, only it is controlled by experiment. The experiment naturally cannot destroy his genius. On the contrary, it confirms it. To take the case of a poet, for example, to show he has a genius, is it necessary that his feeling, his idea, a priori, should be false? Evidently not, for the genius of a man will be so much the greater when experiment has proved the truth of his personal idea. Our age of lyricism, our romantic disease, was alone capable of measuring a man's genius by the quantity of nonsense and folly which he put in circulation. I conclude by saying that in our scientific century, experiment must prove genius. This is the drift of our quarrel with the idealistic writers. They always start out from an irrational source of some kind, such as revelation, a tradition, or conventional authority. As Claude Bernard declares, quote, "We must admit nothing occult. There are but phenomena and the conditions of phenomena." End quote. We naturalistic novelists submit each fact to the test of observation and experiment, while the idealistic writers admit mysterious elements which escape analysis and therefore remain in the unknown outside of the influence of the laws governing nature. This question of the ideal from the scientific point of view reduces itself to a question of indeterminate or determinate. All that we do not know, all that escapes us still, that is truly the ideal, and the aim of our human efforts is each day to reduce the ideal, to conquer truth from the unknown. We are all idealists if we mean by this that we busy ourselves with the ideal. But I dub those idealists who take refuge in the unknown for the pleasure of being there, who have a taste but for the most risky hypotheses, who disdain to submit them to the test of experiment under the pretext that the truth is in themselves and not in the things. These writers, I repeat, accomplish a vain and harmful task, while the observer and the experimentalist are the only ones who work for the strength and happiness of man, making him more and more the master of nature. This is neither nobility, nor dignity, nor beauty, nor morality in the knowing, in lying, in pretending that you are greater according as you advance in error and confusion. The only great and moral works are those of truth. What we alone must accept is what I call the stimulus of the ideal. Certainly our science is very limited as yet, beside the enormous mass of things of which we are ignorant. This great unknown which surrounds us ought to inspire us with the desire to pierce it, to explain it by means of scientific methods. And this does not refer only to scientific men. All the manifestations of human intelligence are connected there together. All our efforts have their birth in the need we feel of making ourselves master of the truth. Claude Bernard explains this very clearly when he writes, quote, The sciences each possess, if not a special method, at least special processes, and moreover they reciprocally serve as tools for one another. Mathematics serves as a tool for physics, to chemistry, and to biology in very different measure. Physics and chemistry serve as powerful tools to physiology and to medicine. In this mutual help which the sciences are to each other, you must distinguish clearly the savant who advances each science and he who makes use of it. The physician and the chemist are not mathematicians because they employ calculation. The physiologist is not a chemist or a physician because he uses chemical reactions or medical instruments, any more than the chemist and the physician are physiologists because they study the compositions or the properties of certain liquids and certain animal or vegetable tissues. End quote. This is the reply which Claude Bernard can be said to make for us naturalists to the critics who taunt us with making pretensions to science. We are neither chemists, nor physicians, nor physiologists. We are simply novelists who depend upon the sciences for support. We certainly do not pretend to have made discoveries in physiology which we do not practice. Only, being obliged to make a study of man, we feel we cannot deny the efficacy of the new physiological truths. And I will add that the novelists are certainly the workers who rely at once upon the greatest number of sciences, for they treat of them all and must know them all. And the novel has become a general inquiry on nature and on man. This is why we have been led to apply to our work the experimental method as soon as this method had become the most powerful tool of investigation. We sum up investigation, we throw ourselves anew into the conquest of the ideal, employing all forms of knowledge. Let it be well understood that I am speaking of the how of things and not of the why. For an experimental savant, the ideal which he is endeavoring to reduce, the indeterminate, is always restricted to the how. He leaves to philosophers the other ideal, that of the why, which he despairs of determining. I think that the experimental novelists equally ought not to occupy themselves with this unknown quality, unless they wish to lose themselves in the follies of the poets and the philosophers. It is surely an object large enough to try to know the entire mechanism of nature without troubling oneself for the time being with the origins of the mechanism. If we some day succeed in knowing it, we shall doubtless owe our knowledge to method. And it is better then to begin at the beginning with the study of phenomena, instead of hoping that a sudden revelation will reveal to us the secret of the world. We are the workmen. We will leave to the metaphysicians this great unknown of the why they have struggled with so vainly over centuries, in order to confine our efforts to that other unknown of the how, which is cleared away more and more every day by our investigation. The only ideal which ought to exist for us, the naturalistic novelists, should be one which we can conquer. But besides, in the slow conquest which we can make over this unknown which surrounds us, we humbly confess the ignorant condition in which we are. We are beginning to march forward, nothing more, and our only real strength lies in our method. Claude Bernard, after acknowledging the experimental medicine is in its infancy still, does not hesitate to give great credit to empirical medicine. In reality, he says, empiricism, that is to say observation or accidental experiment, has been the origin of all science. In the complex sciences dealing with man, empiricism necessarily governs the practice much longer than in those of the more simple sciences. End quote. And he is willing to admit that at the crisis of a disease, when the disease And he is willing to admit that the crisis of a disease, when the determinism or nearest cause of the pathological phenomena has not been found out, the best thing to do is to act empirically. As, moreover, happens in the growth of knowledge, since empiricism invariably precedes the scientific condition of any branch of knowledge. Certainly, if doctors must resort to empiricism in nearly every case, we have much greater reason for using it, we novelists whose science is more complicated and less determined. I say once more, it is not a question of creating the science of man as an individual and as a social being out of the whole cloth. It is only a question of emerging little by little and with all the inevitable struggles from the obscurity in which we lie, concerning our own natures, happy if amid so many errors we can determine one truth. We experiment, that is to say, that for a long time still we must use the false to teach the true. Such is the feeling among strong men. Claude Bernard argues fiercely against those who persist in seeing only an artist as in a doctor. He knows the habitual objections of those who pretend to look upon experimental medicine as a theoretical conception of which nothing for the moment justifies the practical reality, because no fact demonstrates the attainment in medicine of the scientific precision of the experimental sciences. End quote. But he does not let this worry him. He shows that experimental medicine is but the natural outcome of practical medical investigation directed by a scientific mind, end quote. And here is his conclusion, quote, without doubt it will be a long time before medicine becomes truly scientific, but that does not prevent us from conceiving the possibility of such a thing, and doing all that we can to help it by trying daily to introduce into medicine the method which is to lead us to it, end quote. All this, which I will not tire you by repeating, applies perfectly to the experimental novel. Put the word novel in place of medicine, and the passage remains equally true. I will address to the young literary generation which is growing up around me these grand and strong words of Claude Bernard. I know none more manly. Quote, medicine is destined to escape little by little from empiricism, and she will escape, as have all the other sciences, by the experimental method. This profound conviction sustains and controls my scientific life. I am deaf to the voices of those doctors who demand that the causes of scarlatina and measles shall be experimentally shown to them, and who think by that to draw forth an argument against the use of the experimental method in medicine. These discouraging objections and denials generally come from systematic or lazy minds, those who prefer to rest on their systems, or to sleep in darkness instead of making an effort to become enlightened. Systematic minds, I think he has in mind here, possibly Hegel or Kant is my guess. Make an effort to become enlightened. The experimental direction which medicine is taking today is definitely defined, and it is no longer the ephemeral influence of a personal system of any kind. It is the result of the scientific evolution of medicine itself. My convictions in this respect are so strong that I endeavor to impress them clearly upon the minds of the young medical students who are following my course at the Collège de France. The students must be inspired before all else with the scientific spirit and initiated into the ideas and tendencies of modern science. End quote. Though I have frequently written the same words and given the same advice, I will repeat them here. Quote, the experimental method alone can bring the novel out of the atmosphere of lies and errors in which it is plunged. All my literary life has been controlled by this conviction. I am deaf to the voices of the critics who demand that I shall formulate the laws of heredity and the influence of surroundings in my character. Those who make these discouraging objections and denials but speak from slothfulness of mind, from an infatuation for tradition, from an attachment more or less conscious to philosophical and religious beliefs. Okay. Note this desire in Zola to throw away philosophy altogether and replace it with the experimental, what's the word I'm looking for, the empirical sciences. The experimental direction which the novel is taking today is a definite one, and it is no longer the ephemeral influence of a personal system of any kind. It is the result of the scientific evolution, of the study of man himself. My convictions in this respect are so strong that I endeavor to impress them clearly upon the minds of the young writers who read my works. For I think it necessary, above all things else, to inspire them with the scientific spirit and to initiate them into the ideas and the tendencies of modern science. Alright, one more chapter to go, chapter 5. Alright, let me take a short break. Okay, and the last chapter, chapter 5. Before concluding, it is necessary for me to touch upon several secondary points. It is necessary to state the facts precisely on any one subject. If it is necessary to state the facts precisely on any one subject, it is on that of the impersonal character of this method, Some have accused Claude Bernard of wishing to pose as an innovator, and he has replied to these attacks as follows, quote, I have certainly not pretended to be the first to propose the application of physiology to medicine. That was recommended a long time ago, and numerous works have been made in this direction. In my works and in my lectures at the Collège de France, I have only followed out an idea which has already borne fruit in its application to medicine, end quote. This is what I myself have replied when they have accused me of wishing to pose as an innovator and a leader of a new school. I have said that I introduce nothing, that I simply endeavor to apply in my novels and critical essays the scientific method which has been in use for a long time. But naturally they have pretended not to hear me, and they still continue to talk of my vanity and my ignorance. I have already repeated 20 times that naturalism is not a personal fantasy, but that it is the intellectual movement of the century. Perhaps they will believe Claude Bernard, who speaks with greater authority on the subjects than I can claim to. He declares that, quote, The revolution which the experimental method has caused in science consists mainly in the substitution of a scientific criterion for a personal authority. It is the characteristic of the experimental method to depend only on itself, as it carries within itself the criterion which is experiment. It recognizes no authority but that of facts, and it frees itself from personal authority. End quote. Consequently, it no longer admits the authority of any theory either. Quote, the idea should always remain independent. It must be enchained neither by scientific nor philosophical nor religious beliefs. Man must be strong and free in his manifestation of his ideas, must follow his instinct, and not dwell upon the puerile fears of the contradiction of any theories. He must modify theory by adapting it to nature, and not nature by adapting it to theory. From this there results an incomparable breadth. Quote, the experimental method is the scientific method which proclaims the liberty of thought. It not only throws off the philosophical and theological yoke, but it no longer admits scientific personal authority. This is not said from pride or boastfulness. The experimentalist, on the contrary, shows his humility in denying personal authority, for he doubts his own knowledge, and he submits the authority of men to that of experiment and the laws which govern nature. End quote. This is why I have said so many times that the naturalism is not a school, as it is not embodied in the genius of one man, nor in the ravings of a group of men, as was Romanticism, that it consists simply in the application of the experimental to the study of nature and of man. Hence it is nothing but a vast movement, a march forward in which everything is a workman according to his genius. All theories are admitted, and the theory which carries the most weight is the one which explains the most. There does not appear to me to be a literary or scientific path larger or more direct. Everyone, the great and the small, moves freely, working and investigating together, each one in his own specialty, and recognizing no other authority than that of facts proved by experiment. Therefore, in naturalism, there could be neither innovators nor leaders. There are simply workmen, some more skillful than others. Claude Bernard explains the defiance which we should assume toward theories thus, quote, you must have a strong faith and yet not believe. I will explain myself by saying that it is necessary in science to believe firmly in the principles and to doubt the formulas. In fact, on one side we are sure that determinism exists, but we are never certain of possessing it. We must be immovable on the principles of experimental science, determinism, and yet not believe in the theories absolutely. End quote. I will quote the following passage in which he announces the end of systems. Quote, experimental medicine is not a new system of medicine, but on the contrary, the negation of all systems. In fact, the coming of experimental medicine will result in dispersing from science all individual views, to replace them by impersonal and general theories, which will be, as in other sciences, but a regular coordination deduced from the facts furnished by experiment. End quote. If Claude Bernard repels the charge of being an innovator, or rather an inventor, who brings a personal theory with him, he refers also several times to the danger there would be in a savant's meddling with philosophical systems. Quote, the experimental doctor, he says, should neither be a spiritualist nor a materialist. These names belong to an old school of natural philosophy which has fallen into disuse in the progress of science. We shall never fully understand either mind or matter and if this were the proper place, I could easily show that on one side as on the other you soon reach scientific negation, from which it follows that all considerations of this kind are idle and useless. It is for us to study only phenomena, to know the material conditions of their manifestations, and to determine the laws of these manifestations." End quote. I have said that in the experimental novel it is best for us to hold to the strictly scientific point of view if we wish to base our studies on solid ground, not to go out from the how, not to attach ourselves to the why. However, it is very certain that we cannot always escape this need of our intelligence, this restless curiosity which makes us desire to know the essence of things. I think that it is best for us to accept the philosophical system which adapts itself the best to the actual condition of the sciences, but simply from a speculative point of view. For example, transformism is actually the most rational system, and is the one which is based most directly upon our knowledge of nature. Behind the science, behind a manifestation of any kind of human intelligence, there always lies more or less clearly what Claude Bernard calls a philosophical system. To this system it is not well to attach oneself devotedly, but to hold tenaciously to the facts, free to modify the system if the facts call for it. But the system exists nonetheless, and it exists so much the more as science is less advanced and less firm. For us naturalistic novelists, who are still in the lisping stage, hypothesis is fatal. By and by I will take up the role of hypothesis in literature. Nevertheless, if in practice Claude Bernard thrusts aside philosophical system, he recognizes the necessity of philosophy. Quote, "From a scientific point of view, philosophy represents the eternal desire of the human reason after knowledge of the unknown. Hence, philosophers always confine themselves to questions that are in dispute, into those lofty regions that lie beyond the boundaries of science. In this way they communicate to science a certain inspiration which animates and ennobles it. They strengthen the mind, developing it by intellectual gymnastics, at the same time that they ever carry it toward the never completed solution of great problems. Thus they keep up a cult of the unknown and quicken the sacred fire of investigation, which ought never to be extinguished in the heart of a savant." End quote. This passage is very fine, but the philosophers have never been told in better terms that their hypotheses are pure poetry. Claude Bernard evidently looks upon the philosophers, among whom he believes he has a great many friends, as musicians often gifted with genius, whose music encourages the savants while they work and inspires the sacred fire of their great discoveries. But the philosophers, left to themselves, will sing forever and never discover a single truth. I have neglected until now the question of form in the naturalistic novel, because it is precisely there that individuality shows in literature. Not only is a writer's genius to be found in the feeling and in the idea a priori, but also in the form and style. But the question of method and the question of rhetoric are distinct from each other. And by naturalism, I say again, is meant the experimental method, the introduction of observation and experiment into literature. Rhetoric, for the moment, has no place here. Let us first fix upon the method on which there should be agreement, and after that accept all the different styles and letters which may be produced, looking upon them as the expressions of the literary temperament of the writers. If you wish my true opinion upon this subject, it is this, that today an exaggerated importance is given to form. I have a great deal to say on this subject, but it would carry me beyond the limits of this essay. In reality, I think that the form of expression depends upon the method. That language is only one kind of logic, and its construction natural and scientific. He who writes the best will not be the one who gallops madly among hypotheses, but the one who walks straight ahead in the midst of truths. We are actually rotten with lyricism. We are very much mistaken when we think that the characteristic of a good style is a sublime confusion with just a dash of madness added. In reality, the excellence of a style depends upon its logic and clearness. Claude Bernard considers that philosophers are really musicians who play a sort of Marseillaise made up of hypotheses and swell the hearts of the savants as they rush to attack the unknown, and he has much the same idea of artists and writers. I have remarked that a great many of the most intelligent savants, jealous of the scientific certainty which they enjoy, would very willingly confine literature to the ideal. They themselves seem to feel the need of taking little recreations in the world of lies after the fatigue of their exact labours, and they are fond of amusing themselves with the most daring hypotheses, and with fictions which they know perfectly well to be false and ridiculous. Claude Bernard was right when he said, quote, "Literary and artistic productions will never grow old in the sense that they are the expressions of sentiments as unchangeable as human nature," end quote. In fact, form is sufficient to immortalize a work. The spectacle of a powerful individuality reproducing nature in superb language will interest all ages, until the works of a savant from this same point of view will be read always, for the reason that the thought of a great savant who knows how to write is much more interesting than that of a poet. However far astray the savant may be in this hypothesis, he still remains the equal of the poet, who is certain to have been equally mistaken. The point to be emphasized is this, that our domain is not limited to the expression of sentiments as unchangeable as human nature, because it is essential also to exhibit the working of these sentiments. We have not exhausted our matter when we have depicted anger, avarice, and love. All nature and all of man belong to us, not only in their phenomena, but in the causes of these phenomena. I well know that this is an immense field, the entrance to which they would willingly have refused us. But we have broken down the barriers and have entered it in triumph. This is why I do not accept the following words of Claude Bernard. Quote, "In art and letters, personality dominates everything. There one is dealing with a spontaneous creation of the mind that has nothing in common with the verification of natural phenomena, in which our minds create nothing." End quote. I have here detected one of our most illustrious savants sharing in the attempt to refuse to letters the entrée to the scientific field. I do not know what letters he refers to in this definition of a literary work, quote, "a spontaneous creation of the mind that has nothing in common with the verification of natural phenomena," end quote. Doubtless he has lyrical poetry in mind, for he never could have written that phrase had he understood the experimental novel as shown in the works of Balzac and Stendhal. I can only repeat what I have said before, that apart from the matter of form and style, the experimental novelist is only one special kind of savant who makes use of the tools of all other savants, observation and analysis. Our field is the same as the physiologist, only that it is greater. We operate like him on man. And Claude Bernard recognizes this fact for himself, that the cerebral phenomena can be determined the same as other phenomena. It is true that Claude Bernard can tell us that we are lost in hypotheses, but to conclude from this that we shall never arrive at the truth sits very badly on him, as he has struggled all his life to make a science of medicine which the great majority of his contemporaries look upon as an art. Let us clearly define now what is meant by an experimental novelist. Claude Bernard gives the following definition of an artist. Quote, "What is an artist? He is a man who realizes in a work of art an idea or a sentiment which is personal to him." End quote. I absolutely reject this definition. On this basis, if I represented a man as walking on his head, I should have made a work of art, if such happened to be my personal sentiments. But in that case, I should be a fool and nothing else. So one must add that the personal feeling of the artist is always subject to the higher law of truth and nature. We now come to the question of hypothesis. The artist starts out from the same point as the savant. He places himself before nature, has an idea a priori, and works according to this idea. Here alone he separates himself from the savant if he carries out his idea to the end without verifying its truth by the means of observation and experiment. Those who make use of experiment might be called experimental artists, but then people will tell us that there are no longer artists, since such people regard art as the burden of personal error which the artist has put into his study of nature. I contend that the personality of the writer should only appear in the idea a priori and in the form, not in the infatuation for the false. I see no objection besides to its showing in the hypothesis, but it is necessary to clearly understand what you mean by these words. It has often been said that writers ought to open the way for savants. This is true, for we have seen in the introduction that hypothesis and empiricism precede and prepare for the scientific state, which is established finally by the experimental method. Man commenced by venturing certain explanations of phenomena. The poets gave expression to their emotions, and the savants ended by mastering hypotheses and fixing the truth. Claude Bernard always assigns the role of pioneers to the philosophers. It is a very noble role, and today it is the writers who should assume it and who should endeavor to fill it worthily. Only let it be well understood that each time that a truth is established by the savants, the writers should immediately abandon their hypothesis to adopt this truth. Otherwise they will remain deliberately in error without benefiting anyone. It is thus that science, as it advances, furnishes to us writers a solid ground upon which we should lean for support, to better enable us to shoot into new hypotheses. In a word, every phenomenon, once clearly determined, destroys the hypothesis which it replaces, and it is then necessary to transport your hypothesis one step further into the new unknown which arises. I will take a very simple example in order to make myself better understood. It has been proved that the earth revolves around the sun. What would you think of a poet who should adopt the old belief that the sun revolves around the earth? Evidently the poet, if he wishes to risk a personal explanation of any fact, should choose a fact whose cause is not already known. This then illustrates the position hypothesis should occupy for experimental novelists. We must accept determined facts and not attempt to risk about them our personal sentiments, which would be ridiculous, building throughout on the territory that science has conquered. Then before the unknown, but only then, exercising our intuition and suggesting the way to science, free to make mistakes, happy if we produce any data toward the solution of the problem. Here I stand at Claude Bernard's practical program, who is forced to accept empiricism as a necessary forerunner. In our experimental novel, we can easily risk a few hypotheses on the question of heredity and surroundings. After having respected all that science knows today about matter, We can prepare the ways, we can furnish the results of observation, human data which may prove very useful. A great lyrical poet has written lately that our century is a century of prophets. Yes, if you wish it. Only let it be well understood that these prophets rely neither upon the irrational nor the supernatural. If the prophets thought best to bring up again the most elementary notions, to serve up nature with a strange religious and philosophical sauce, to hold fast to the metaphysical man, to confound and obscure everything, the prophets, notwithstanding their genius in matters of style, would never be anything but great gooses, ignorant whether they would get wet if they jumped into the water. In our scientific age, it is a very delicate thing to be a prophet, as we no longer believe in the truths of revelation, and in order to be able to foresee the unknown, we must begin by studying the known. The conclusion to which I wish to come is this. If I were to define the experimental novel, I would not say, as Claude Bernard says, that a literary work lies entirely in the personal feeling, for the reason that, in my opinion, the personal feeling is but the first impulse. Later, nature, being there, makes itself felt, or at least that part of nature of which science has given us the secret, and about which we have no longer any right to romance. The experimental novelist is therefore the one who accepts proven facts, who points out in man and in society the mechanism of the phenomena over which science is mistress, and who does not interpose his personal sentiments except in the phenomena whose determinism is not yet settled, and who tries to test as much as he can this personal sentiment, this idea a priori, by observation and experiment. I cannot understand how our naturalistic literature can mean anything else. I have only spoken of the experimental novel, but I am fairly convinced that the same method, after having triumphed in history and in criticism, will triumph everywhere, on the stage and in poetry itself even. It is an inevitable evolution. Literature, in spite of all of that can be said, does not depend merely upon the author. It is influenced by the nature it depicts and by the man whom it studies. Now, if the savants change their ideas of nature, if they find the true mechanism of life, they force us to follow them, to precede them even, so as to play our role in the new hypotheses. The metaphysical man is dead. Our whole territory is transformed by the advent of the physiological man. No doubt Achilles' anger, Dido's love will last forever on account of their beauty, but today we feel the necessity of analyzing anger and love, of discovering exactly how such passions work in the human being. This view of the matter is a new one. We have become experimentalists instead of philosophers. In short, everything is summed up in this great fact. The experimental method in letters, as in the sciences, is in the way to explain the natural phenomena, both individual and social, of which metaphysics until now has given only irrational and supernatural explanations.